I want to begin with 5, I call, non-negotiable points about sexuality when you think of sexuality in a Christian sense. Okay? And the first one's this. And even though we say it so often, and we say it again and again and again, you can't say it too often. And that is, you always begin with a theology and a spirituality of sexuality by affirming its goodness. Sex is good. And even though we say that, we struggle to believe it. And again, I want to say this sympathetically. That isn't easy, and it's not because we're Catholic or Christian or whatever. Everybody ultimately struggles with that, because its power is just so powerful. It's hard for us to simply accept its goodness. So that has to be said again and again and again. Okay. Secondly, and very importantly, this is very Christian and it's very Catholic, although it's also true for most Protestant denominations, and it's also true, incidentally, for Islam. I think one of our great allies in terms of sexual ethos today, and not necessarily on always status of women, but ethos is our Islamic brothers and sisters. They still take the sacredness of sexuality seriously. But for a Christian, sex is sacred. And what that means is it's either sacrament or it's sin. It's kind of a simple way of putting it. So you can't have casual, non-meaning, recreational, whatever sexuality. For a Christian, either sex is a sacrament, and what that means is this. It's bringing God into your life. It is bringing, peace. It's softening your soul. It's making you more altruistic. It's doing good things for you. It's gluing your soul together. Or it's perverse, which means it's hardening your soul. It's making you more selfish. It's leading you away from community and so on. And sex will always do one or the other. So that it's either leading us to greater depth, to greater honesty, it's either softening your soul or it's hardening your soul. And this isn't abstract, An example, when a person starts having affairs and acting out dishonest sexually, what's usually the first symptom of that is? A certain hardness of soul. They begin hardening inside. You see it all the time, Hardness sets in, And that's attached sometimes not to the sex, but to the lying that has to go on, and, hidden life and so on. So sex is either leading us more deeply into life or it's leading us away from life, always. And so for a Christian, we say there is no such thing as casual recreational sex. Now, our society protests that. I know how many young people have said that to me. Said, no, that's your ethos. And how many of you have parents have heard that, where your kids say, no, we don't have your sexual values. That's the way you were raised, and we were raised in this way, and this works too. Well, it doesn't quite work, as a history of heartbreaks and everything else shows. I remember once listening to I'll put it this way generously, an over-liberal speaker speaking about sexuality. There's a woman, and she says, the church has always been far too uptight about sexuality. About that part, she's right. She says, what are they afraid of? Who's ever been hurt by sex? Whoa, that one won't get you to the bank, See, who's ever been hurt by sex? Millions of people. What psychologists estimate today with teenage suicide, in a high percentage of teenage suicide, a fractured sexuality, and probably sexual abuse is the root of that. But our sexuality is a very integral part of our health, and to the degree that we act out on it, to that degree, we're running some risks. A lot of people have been hurt. Who's ever been hurt? How many marriages have broken up and lives destroyed and so on? Irresponsible sexuality wreaks a havoc. And see, the Christian taboos that we've laid around sexuality, maybe sometimes almost too strong, they have that in mind. They say, you can become unglued in a hurry. See, healthy, sacramental sexuality glues you together more deeply as a person. Any kind of unhealthy sexuality is going to unravel you. It literally unravels your psyche and makes you into a different kind of person. There's a British author, Jack Dominion, who's a psychologist and a very fine writer. He has written some eloquent pieces that I very much recommend to Christian couples, in which he talks about how sex inside of a Christian marriage is your Eucharist. It becomes Eucharist for you. And that's not just a play of words and so on, because it sets loose the whole thing of Thanksgiving and so on. So sacramental sex, which is good, healthy sex inside of a marriage, it's sacramental, it's Eucharist. But then conversely, a non-sacramental sex is the reverse. It's perverse. And it's very, very important that we emphasize that, because our society today, and we're on the edges of not believing that. You know, you get intimidated by your kids or by youthful culture, which says, no, you can do this, and nobody gets hurt. And then at a certain point, I mature and I take my sexuality back home and I re-sacralize it and I get married and I become monogamous and so on. And in fact, because God has made the body and the human psyche and soul pretty resilient, oftentimes, in fact, people do get away with it, you know. I think when God created the human person, he realized that there's going to be a lot of immaturity and a lot of mistakes. And some of that is programmed in. So people can sometimes get away, luckily, with some immaturity for a while, but you won't for long, you know. See, because this is innate inside of sexuality. It's sacred, you know. And proper sex is sacramental, and it leads you deeper into life, deeper into everything, and it softens your soul and glues your soul together. Sex that isn't sacramental ends up hardening your soul and unraveling your soul, and sometimes radically, and leading us away from community and away from deeper life. Okay, that's the second thing. It's good, it's sacred. Thirdly, we have to affirm the power of sexuality. I think sometimes, both in the secular world and in church circles, we don't sufficiently affirm how powerful that power is. A lot of denial about, oh, this is just another thing. And this is really a powerful, powerful power. Okay, now, so that it's powerful and it's oftentimes unfriendly. And here I want to pick on the liberal community. That's the great liberal naivete. Conservatives, to their credit, get this. Sometimes get it stronger than they need to get it, but they got it, you know. See, conservatives realize sexuality, you got to be real, real careful. And that's why, you know, admonition coming out of conservative, whether it's theology or culture, is always careful, careful, careful. You can't be too careful. And the liberal community goes, no, we can handle all this stuff. Well, that's a naivete. Carl Jung, the great psychologist, once says, we think energy is friendly and it isn't. We think energy is friendly and it's not. Not because it isn't good. Let me take a text for you. You know, when Moses first goes up the mountain to meet God, and Moses is quite curious, as is the Jewish community at the time, as to what God looks like. So Moses asked God to see him. He said, I'd like to see your face. And then in this curious thing, God says, no, nobody can see my face. Nobody can see the face of God and live. Then he makes that deal with Moses. He said, I'll put you in the rock and I'll cover your face with my hand and I'll move away and then you'll see my back, but you won't see my face. Why can't we see God's face? Okay, not that God's face isn't good, because it's just too powerful. Now, let me give you an example of that. Ask you this question. If someone says to you, what's wrong with pornography? What's wrong with watching sex? Okay, and incidentally, psychologists today say pornography is probably the biggest, internet pornography is today no doubt the biggest single addiction on this planet and growing worse. So what's wrong with watching pornography? Okay, now if I could be a strident liberal here, I'd say, you know, like, we're just too uptight. Sex is the most beautiful thing God ever created, so what's wrong with watching it? So how do you argue against that? Well, you start with Scripture. Nobody can see the face of God and live. I want to give you an example which I write up in The Holy Longing. Some years ago in Canada, CBC Television, who puts out their own kind of home box office movies, they did a movie, made for television movie, a 2-hour special on this. They had this story, and it was 4 couples in southern Ontario, the Toronto area, and they were all now in their mid-50s, and their kids were growing, and they had been university friends, and they decided to celebrate, their coming of age and their last kids leaving home. They were going to do a 2-month vacation across the country. They rented Winnebagos, and they loaded them with beer and cognac and steaks and so on, and they set out across the country to, enjoy a summer of youth. We're free from our kids, And so they set out, 4 couples, 4 Winnebagos, and, each night they camp and they barbecue steaks and they have their beers and they talk about how wonderful it is and they're enjoying this. And until about the 4th or 5th night, they get to a place called Gimli, Manitoba, which is just outside of Winnipeg. And they get on this campground late on a Friday night. They've had their barbecue, and a bunch of younger people descend on this camp, and there's a sexual orgy. The kids are having sex under trees and so on. And these, 50-somethings, who think they're pretty liberal and so on. You know something? It ruins the rest of your trip. The next morning, they're snippy with each other, and they're frustrated, and they're all saying, what's our society coming to? These are our kids, and so on. Now, what happened? They go into a depression that nails it. See, you know why you can't watch pornography? Not because sex isn't good, it isn't beautiful. It's too powerful. They were watching Eros and Aphrodite making love under a tree. That's archetype. You can't look at that. Because if you look at it, you know what happens? It depresses you. It has to, because it overstimulates your grandiosity. And then you have to turn on all your cooling jets and you go into what psychologists call an adaptive depression. You just sizzle inside of your own depression, So what's wrong with pornography? It's thoroughly depressing. That's what's wrong with it. It's also unhealthy in terms of the images it forms and how we understand each other and so on. But at a deep archetypal level, it's simply, you don't watch sex, not because it's wrong, because it's too powerful. That's the exact question Moses asked God. He said, why can't I see your face? Why can't I watch pornography? It's too powerful. You can't, That's energy. And I'm going to talk about that. That's why in our spirituality of sexuality, why chastity has been such a significant and important concept in Christianity and in Islamic culture and other places and so on. Islamic culture even takes it further. Just the importance of being chaste. And we'll look at that. See, chastity, before I go into it, you know what it is? Chastity is the insulation you put around electricity. Who understands this talk the best is always the electricians. They get this perfectly. If you go outside and you look across some fields, and you'll see these power lines up there, and you got all these wires, and each of them has 50,000 volts in it. Okay? Now, there's a lot of heat and light in there, and that's good. But if you try to hook your house up to that, it'll burn your house down. It's got to go through some transformers, and it's got to be encased in certain kinds of insulation and so on, and then electricity becomes safe. Well, sexuality is a lot more than 100,000 volts. And see, if you would deal with electricity naively, you soon get electrocuted. When we deal with sexuality naively, we soon hurt each other and hurt ourselves and so on. And that's the Christian concept of chastity. So see, chastity is the insulation, the taboos, the rules, the things you have to put around it. I'm going to explain in a few minutes what a healthy chastity is, okay? And that's such a significant part of a Christian spirituality, of sexuality. And then the last point is, sexuality is a perpetual dis-ease. Notice I don't say disease. Disease is pathological. Dis-ease is normal. Well, that's just normal pathology. Remember Freud said, all normal people are neurotic, and that's good. You want to be, because if you're not neurotic, you're psychotic, and that's crazy. Okay. See, neurotic people, it's just us, we're jumping out of our skins and we don't get our lives together and all kinds of stuff. See, and part of that is sexuality. Sexuality is a deep dis-ease. There'll always be a disquiet. There'll always be it's not necessarily even felt as sexual energy, but at its root, it's there. Henry Nouwen used to express this eloquently. Henry Nouwen says, as human beings, we aren't restful people who occasionally get restless. He said, we're restless people who occasionally experience rest. We're not people who live in serenity and solitude and sometimes are out of sorts. We're people who are out of sorts who sometimes experience serenity and solitude. We aren't people who live in constant intimacy and wonderful community and who sometimes feel a little lonely. We're lonely people who sometimes experience intimacy. Notice where the default lies, And part of that deep root is our sexuality. It's just so powerful because it's godly energy. And godly energy doesn't make easy peace with anything this life has to offer it. Augustine's famous line he began his Confessions with, "You've made us for yourself, Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." See, this sexual thing, it's driving us out. It's driving the teenager with all his hormones. It's driving the grandma and the grandpa to see their grandkid. It's driving Mother Teresa to feed the poor in India. It's driving artists. It's driving everything, okay? But it's driving us all the time in different forms, in different ways. It's a perpetual disease. Dis-ease, not a disease. Now, I want to say a few words about, very important, in a Christian spirituality or theology of sexuality, sexuality is linked always, inextricably, non-negotiably, to a monogamous commitment inside of a marriage. And again, that is one of the things that has loosened up today. If someone said, name the single biggest, psychological thing that's happened in Western culture in the last 60 years, I'd say this. You know what Western culture has done? It's severed the link between sex and marriage, which has been in cultures for centuries and so on. See that even when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, the idea was people sometimes had sex outside of marriage, but it was never theoretically justified. See, sex had to do with marriage. Today, we're now in a culture where sex is an extension of dating. Sex is simply a relational tool you can use in whatever way you want. It can be linked to marriage, and it doesn't have to be linked to marriage. That's where our culture has evolved to, if the word evolution is the right verb, But see, we've severed that link. That's a centuries-old link. But Christianity hasn't got any truck with that. Christianity says, no, you can't do it. In Christianity, sex can only be sacramental. It can only do what it's meant to do, which is lead us to family and community and this way of life, when it's inside of commitment, inside of permanent commitment, which means marriage, okay, monogamy, okay. Now, why do we say that? How would you argue that? Because it's very much argued against. Why does sex have to be inside of a marriage? Well, you can argue, people oftentimes argue the social consequences of that, and actually those arguments, if you really take them to their finest point, they make good points. What society has often recognized, even though it didn't articulate it very well, was that, family and monogamy inside of marriage is the staple that holds a society together. So that once marriage goes and family breaks down, societies often unravel pretty quickly. So that marriage and family is one of the deep things that holds the structural pieces that hold society together. But you can come at this also psychologically, and spiritually, and it's this, that, what's wrong with sex outside of marriage? It can never be honest. It's just that. It can never be honest in this sense, that sex, by its very innate nature, speaks of unconditionality. It speaks of giving yourself over without conditions. And when we have sex outside of marriage, we're always having sex with conditions, And so, in that sense, it can never be fully honest. It's always partly a schizophrenic act, always. So that the only place, see, sex by its very nature speaks, I'm giving myself to you exclusively and permanently and only to you and unconditionally. And outside of marriage, you can't say that. And outside of marriage, we never say that. In fact, that's why today, and I know a lot of sincere young kids and so on who lived together before marriage and so on. And it's not that they're bad people, but see, they're having trial marriage, you might say, or trial sex. I'll be with you if it works out. Well, that's a condition. It's like marrying somebody with an exit visa in your back pocket. I'll love you until it doesn't work, and then we bail out. See, that itself goes against the very structure and deep nature of sexuality. And vice versa. See, commitment and the deepness is precisely what triggers the real spiritual benefit and fruit of sexuality. So that the reason why Christians have always said, and I think will always say, sex can't be fully wholesome outside of marriage is because by its nature it speaks of this permanency, of this exclusivity, of unconditional love. And when it's outside of marriage, there's always inside of conditional love. And that is why normally, today some of that is breaking down, but why normally sex outside of marriage, when I say it can't be fully honest, that isn't just abstract. Oftentimes precisely, it isn't fully honest. That's why it's lied about and hidden and so on. I used to have a vicar general, vicar when I was provincial, who was a priest who was in recovery for a long time, and a wonderful man. And he used to say, addictions are not much about a chemical. He said, alcoholism or other addictions, he said, sobriety is 95% about honesty and about 5% about a chemical. And he said, you only need one moral principle in your life. You only need one moral principle. He says, you can do anything as long as you don't have to lie about it. Just try that on for a moral principle. You can do anything as long as you don't have to lie about it. That limits it a lot. That'll get us pretty well solidly inside the Ten Commandments and a few other places. He said, it's the lying that hangs you. It's not, not even so much the sex out an extramarital affair. It's not so much the sex, the lying, the dishonesty, the disruption, the betrayal. Those are the deadly parts. And we're doing that even when we're not married. There's still a betrayal. We're betraying our future partner. We're betraying this. We're betraying ourselves. Okay, and we're betraying that very person we're having sex with, because our action is not fully honest. That's why the church has always said and will always say, sex is exclusive to marriage. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, because this has been so critical and so misunderstood, and is even more misunderstood today, and that's the concept of chastity as that insulation that protects the way sexuality can healthily flow into our lives. In 1987, Ellen Blum, the famous educator at the University of Chicago, wrote this book called The Closing of the American Mind. And that was a very interesting book because he was a pure secular analyst. And so what he's going to say about what I'm going to quote him on, notice that isn't coming from a church pulpit. That isn't coming from Teens for Chastity and so on. Not that there's anything wrong with Teens for Chastity, but you say, well, that's what they're going to say. This is a powerful, brilliant, secular educator. The lack of chastity in American culture today is that it's the biggest single thing closing the American mind. It's quite a statement. Now, early on in the book, he tells his own story. He says, he said when I was a young boy, I was a pretty brilliant student, and he won a scholarship, a very prestigious scholarship to Cornell University. And he said, I walked in my first class there, and I was 19 years old, and the professor came out. He said, world-class professor. And he said to us, well, you come here from your little towns, from your parochial backgrounds. He said, with your narrowness, he said, and I'm going to bathe you in great truth, and I'm going to set you free. And Blum said he actually reminded me of a little boy who told me when I was 7 years old that there was no Santa and no Easter Bunny. He said, but he wasn't bathing me in any great truth. He said he was showing off. He said, and so was the prof. He said, so after I got my mark from him and he could do no further damage to me, he said, I went and I saw him and said, Professor, you know what I learned from you? I learned that I'll forever teach the very opposite that you do. And he said, and I've kept that promise. He said, I teach, he said, university kids come in, he said, they're sophisticated, they've been everywhere, they've done everything. He said, I always start my classes this way. He said, you're really sophisticated. And he said, you've been everywhere, you've had so many experiences, and I'm going to try to teach you how to believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny again. He said, and maybe you will have a chance to be happy in this life. See, you're over-sophisticated. He said, I'm going to try to bring you to a second naivete. I'm going to try to bring you back to some chastity. And he uses that expression. He says, and because of lack of chastity, and not just talking about sexual chastity, as we're going to define it, he said, lack of chastity, he said, it's made our eros go lame. He said, there aren't high ideals. There isn't high eros in most young people because there's never been any chastity there. Okay, what is chastity? Chastity, first of all, is not celibacy. It's not the same thing celibacy at all. See, I can be celibate and not chaste. Somebody can have sex every day and be very chaste. My parents were two of the most chaste people I've ever met in my life. They had lots of sex. As a huge family gives testimony to, you know, and none of us were immaculately conceived. You can bet on that, you know. In fact, in this planet, only one person has ever been miraculously conceived, and the rest of us, we are the product of sex. Okay, we sometimes forget about that. Okay, and so it's not the same thing as celibacy. Again, you can be celibate and not chaste. You can be very sexually active and chaste. And secondly, it's not a frigidity. Chastity has nothing to do with devaluating sex or, you know, I have sex, but only that I can have children and so on, and I try not to enjoy it and all kinds of stuff like that and nonsense, you know. So chastity isn't celibacy, and it isn't some kind of lack of enjoyment of sexuality and so on. In fact, it's the opposite, okay? And thirdly, chastity isn't, first of all, an exclusively sexual concept. Chastity has to do with the whole way we experience life. It's the whole way we either believe in Santa and the Easter Bunny or don't, okay? So give you an example of lack of chastity that has nothing to do with sexuality. Imagine that today sometimes, and I'm going to talk about this, the struggle we have to wait in our culture for anything. And the struggle young people have to wait, and sometimes we're well-meaning and we rush everything and so on, and we sexualize little kids, but not just sexualize, but all kinds of experiences. Take an example. So let's take a little kid, and you're the parent or the grandparent, and you love this little kid, and so you give the kid everything, you know. When the kid is 3, it goes to Disneyland the first time. At 4, it goes to Disneyland the second time. At 5, it has every gadget. At 6, it has its own computer. At 7, its own cell phone, its own iPad, its own everything, and it goes everywhere. It does what all the big kids do, which is what the little kids want, and so on. And at 15, the kid says, oh, I'm so bored, the whole world stinks. Surprise? No. They're 15 going on 45. See, they've done everything. They've been everywhere. Why shouldn't this kid be bored, irritated, you know? I very much enjoy the cartoon Jeremy, which is especially the Sunday things, you know, it's about this teenager. And one of the cartoons recently, he's in his room, and you can see about 8 different electronic equipment there, you know. He's got one computer open, an iPad, an iPhone, this, and a cell phone. He's saying, God, I'm bored. There's nothing to do, you know. See, it's a lack of chastity. A little to do with sexuality. It's just, I'm 15. I've done everything. What's left? And then, let's apply it to sexuality. Is it any wonder that this kid is pressured to start becoming sexually active at a very young age? You know, sometimes I'm horrified by, you know, which things are done innocently. Just the Walgreens drugstore that I live close by there, you know. And Walgreens is about as family an institution as you can get, you know. And I walk by there and they have little, like, for babies, you know, tops, you know, little sweaters, and so, you know, my mom is hot, and so on. Who comes up with this stuff? I mean, it's sick, like you're sexualizing it. Of course, I mean, you mean it well, but this is a baby. You know, or 3-year-olds, you know, come over to my play corner and so on. Like, I mean, it shows where our society is at. Now, this is done by sincere and good people. But see, that's what Bloom is saying, that it's a lack of chastity, and we're not helping our kids by doing this. Let me give you an example of that. Carlo Corretto the great Italian spiritual writer. At one point, he was out in the Sahara Desert for about 12 years on a stretch. And he was, learning the Bedouin language and translating the scriptures and praying out in the desert. And some journalist went out to the desert to visit him. And the journalist says, now, Father Credo, he said, you've been out in the desert here for 12 years praying. He said, if you could send one message back to the world, he said, what would it be? What do you hear God saying? And Credo said, go back and tell him to learn how to wait. He said, God is saying, be patient. Wait for everything. He said, wait for everything. Wait for sex, wait for love, wait to, buy the house you need and so on, And he said, and learn especially to wait for God. It's very interesting. Our Christian symbolism is so rich, and sometimes we miss what it says. So, for instance, why do we emphasize so much that Jesus had to be born from a chaste womb? And incidentally, they extend the metaphor. Notice Jesus is born in a chaste womb, and then he's laid in a chaste tomb. Remember, he's put into a tomb in which nobody else has ever been. These are beautiful, powerful symbols. See, Jesus has to be born out of a chaste womb. He has to be buried in a chaste tomb, This is high spirituality and theology, sexuality. So it's not celibacy, it's not frigidity, it's not necessarily a sexual concept. It's what? I want to name 5 things, okay? It's proper reverence and respect. Proper reverence and respect, okay? For everything, not least for sexuality. The text you want there, you can have a beautiful biblical text there, and that's the text of Moses before the burning bush. See, Moses' first real encounter with God, before he meets God on mountains and so on, he meets God in the burning bush, and the voice of God speaks to him and says, Moses, take off your shoes because the ground you're standing on is holy ground. That is an invitation to chastity, see, respect. The idea of having your shoes off. It's an image of respect because the ground you're standing on is sacred ground. Now, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. What, perhaps more than any other single feature, sours and kills and deflates relationships inside of marriage, family, friendships? Simply this, taking each other for granted. It's just my kids, my wife. So, see, our shoes are back on before the burning bush. The other person, your wife, your husband, whoever, your kids, your friends, they are sacred ground. And sometimes in our best moments, we realize that. In other moments, it's just, it's another ground. I'll give you a little cartoon on that. Some years ago, High and Lois, the cartoon High and Lois, but they had a 4-frame job on a Monday morning, brilliant cartoon. And on the first frame, they show High, and he's the husband, and he's an accountant, and he's going to work, and he's on the bus. And he says, another dumb day going to the same dumb office, working on the same stupid figures I must have worked on 100,000 times. Second frame, his wife, and she's vacuuming the floor as the kids are gone. She says, another dumb day cleaning this stupid house, and then I cleaned it 1,000 times, I have to clean it 1,000 times more. In the third frame, the kids are in the bus, in the school bus, and one says to the other, another dumb day, dumb school, dumb teachers, and so on. And the last frame is the little girl Trixie, who's about 2 years old, and she wakes up in her crib, and the sun is shining, and she puts her arms up and says, another day. Okay. She's ready. She's pumped. See, she's got her shoes off before the burning bush. See, chastity is about reverence and respect. To a point where, I said before, this vicar of mine used to say, you can do anything, there's only one moral principle. And that is, as long as you don't have to lie. I'll give you a second moral principle. You can do anything as long as there's proper reverence. In the end, all sins are sins of irreverence in some way. Every sin is a sin of disrespect. You're disrespecting a person, you're disrespecting God, you're disrespecting yourself, you're disrespecting some property. Like in every case, every sin in some sense is a sin against chastity. It's a sin of irreverence. You just name me something that, any sin that is not irreverent, you know. See, so that it's reverence and respect. Then secondly, chastity is patience. Chastity is basically to not do anything that's premature. Let me give you a wonderful image from Annie Dillard, the writer. Annie Dillard tells the story in her book, Holy the Firm. And she said she was spending this one summer writing, and she was in a cabin in Kentucky. And she said she was living in this cabin, and at one point she was watching a moth come out of its cocoon. And she was watching this with fascination, but it was a very, very slow process. So she watched for a while, and she was trying, just watch this moth come out of its cocoon. But at a certain point, she got impatient. So she took a candle, and she just heated the thing very slowly, and then the moth came out faster, and it emerged from its cocoon. But then, because it came out too fast, its wings were damaged, and it couldn't fly. See, she rushed a natural process. She didn't even interfere with the process. She just rushed it. And then its wings didn't form properly, and correspondingly, it couldn't fly. See, chastity is about waiting till things are mature and to never to act prematurely. So you can already see where this fits sexually, You go to bed with the bride before the wedding, it's premature. But we do it in other ways. That's equivalent to, just take a non-sexual example. Imagine a kid sees the present under the Christmas tree. And I know some kids who have done that, and they can't wait. It's still 6 more days to Christmas, but I don't know what I'm getting. So at night when the parents are in bed, they come down there and wrap the present, and they look what it is. Now, that's a fault in chastity. Notice, I can't let the tension build. I can't live the tension. I can't wait. Okay? See, and then we do it prematurely, and that's a fault in chastity. And that's one of the great pressures in sexuality. See, so the church, in its wisdom, sometimes overemphasizes it. Careful with sexuality. First of all, proper reverence and respect. Secondly, you wait. You wait until marriage. You wait until you've made a commitment of unconditionality before you can express love unconditionally. You wait. Then thirdly, chastity as pondering. It's interesting, that's the verb they use about marry in Scripture, and almost exclusively about Mary. Notice in the New Testament, Mary ponders, and she gets it right, and nobody else ponders, and they don't get it right. What do the others do? The opposite of pondering in Scripture is not to not ponder. The opposite of pondering in Scripture is to be amazed. See, the crowd was amazed that Mary pondered these things. Pondering for a Hebrew. Now, Mary was a Hebrew. Don't think of pondering the way you think of it in the Greek sense. See, we think in Greek software. And for us, pondering means to try to think deep thoughts, to try to think something through, to journal, to do Ignatian discernment, and so on, which is wonderful, but it's not what Mary did. Mary was a Hebrew. If Aristotle had written Scripture, then our concept of pondering would be what it is. Aristotle didn't write Scripture. For a Hebrew, to ponder meant to carry tension and to not short-circuit the tension until the tension takes you to where you should go. Okay? I'll give you a secular example of that. You ever saw the movie, which is a great movie? Or let me give you a contrast of 2 movies. You can do some homework on this. Rent the video, and rent them in this order. First, rent the video, Robert Waller's famous picture, The Bridges of Madison County. Meryl Streep and Clint Eastwood and so on. Okay, and since this was this wonderful romantic piece, but it's a piece about how we view our ethos and our lack of chastity. So anyway, Clint Eastwood is a photographer for National Geographic. He gets lost in Madison County, Iowa. He's driving around with his pickup truck. He comes to this house, Meryl Streep's the housewife, and as luck would have it, her husband's just gone off to some boring cattle show in Minneapolis. Poor man, And they meet, and their eyes lock, and they fall in love. And we shouldn't be cynical about that. That happens. Iris Murdoch used to say it only takes 15 seconds for the whole world to change. You can fall in love, okay? That part's okay. Then they pore over maps and she cooks supper, and 2 hours later they're in bed. And you're supposed to believe that something sublime happened here, because they've sublimated tension for a solid 2 hours. It'd be like having a baby in 2 hours, writing your doctoral thesis in 2 hours. Notice the word sublime comes from the word sublimation. It's predicated on, there's got to be carrying of tension for something to be sublime. Then after you've watched Bridges of Madison County, it's a powerful psychological movie. It's not something you use as a catechetical tool for instructing young kids, okay? Then get the Jane Austen picture, Sense and Sensibility. And watch the hero in there, Emma Thompson, how she has to carry a tension in love that's powerful, it's long, and it's unfair, and she carries it for a long time, for some years. And then when it's resolved, there's true sublimity, because she lived and carried this tension. See, that's a picture of chastity. And that's the way they show Mary. See, everybody else, the crowds. It's interesting. New Testament scholars will tell you, in the Gospels, whenever they have the word the crowd, you can supply the adjective mindless. It's true. They don't do it, but you could. They say whenever you have the word the crowd, just supply mindless. Crowds don't have a mind. It's not because they're bad. See, crowds simply, they're amazed. Amazement means you conduct energy. The way an electrical cord, it's simply what goes in is what comes out. That's what crowds do. Okay? So you go to a football game and the opening kickoff, your halfback runs it back for a touchdown, you'll make him mayor of the city right then. Fourth quarter, he fumbles away the game, shoot him, See, crowds. And notice how Jesus is afraid of crowds. He rides in on Jerusalem on Palm Sunday in the morning, and the crowd saying, "We'll make you king." 5 days later, very little has changed. The same people are shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." See, crowds conduct energy. They don't think. And that's why crowds are so dangerous. There's some beautiful expressions. John, when he writes up the woman caught in adultery, and he plays that motif. He says, one day Jesus was alone, and a crowd, mindless, brought a woman, and they said, we caught her in the very act of committing adultery. And then Jesus did that gesture with his hands and so on, which is profound. Then he says, let the person who is without sin cast the first stone. And then what happens? John said, they walked away one by one. See, they came as a mindless crowd. They walked away as reflective individuals. They they came in amazement. They walked away pondering. See, chastity invites us to carry tension. A great little story. In fact, I quote him a number of times in The Holy Longing. He's a Czechoslovakian writer. Ivan Klima wrote a series of very fine books translated into English. And one of them he wrote was called My First Loves. And these were essays and autobiographical essays written while he was still living under communist Czechoslovakia. So you have this young writer, and he grew up an atheist. He grew up an atheist, a Marxist, kind of resisting Marxism, but deep inside and trying to sort himself out. But in there he shares how he was growing up in communist Czechoslovakia and with artistic friends who were pretty liberal and so on, and how there was so much pressure on him sexually and so on, and how he always resisted. He didn't even know why. He didn't have any religious convictions, but he always had this sense that somehow there's got to be a higher way of doing this. And then he ends the book, and he has this great line. He says, if there is a God, he says, I wonder how God is looking at me right now. He said, I wonder if God is looking at me and saying, Ivan, why don't you just live? He said, are you too timid? Are you too afraid? Is there something, are you a frigid young man? He said, or is he looking at me, he said, and congratulating on me on carrying my solitude at a high level. It's a beautiful expression. The last words of the book, he said, or is God looking at me and is happy with me because I'm carrying my solitude at a high level? See, Mary in Scripture carried her solitude at a high level. Jesus carried his solitude at a high level. See, chastity asks us to carry our solitude at a high level. And it'll always be in contradistinction to the crowd. Okay? You know, give you an example of this, because it's so easy to lose that. I remember giving a talk way back, this was to university kids, on marriage. And I was giving the line about, you know, waiting till marriage, the church line, and so on. And one of the young men stood up and he says, you know, Father, he said, I agree with you. I agree with you idealistically. He said, that's really a wonderful ideal. He said, but you'd have to be 1 in 1,000 to live that. He said, it's a wonderful ideal, but you'd have to be 1 in 1,000 to live that. So I said to him, the young woman be sitting beside you, you going to marry her someday? He said, yeah, I hope so. She'll have me. I said, well, what kind of marriage do you want? Do you want one like everybody else's, or do you want 1 in 1,000? He said, I got my answer. Okay. See, if you want to be, you know, a relationship that's 1 in 1,000, you got to do what only 1 in 1,000 does. If we do what everybody else does, everybody's doing it, well, then you're going to have relationships just like everybody else. It's not even a question of what's so right or what's so wrong. It's at what level do you want to buy in? At what level do you want to function? Or as Ivan Klima says, at what level do you want to carry your solitude? You want to carry it at a high level, or you want to carry it at a lower level? It's not that God destroys us or whatever, you know. See, to carry your solitude at a high level. And then chastity is also heightening the joy and the goodness of sexuality by protecting it properly. Now this is a hard one to explain, but I can try in terms of image. You know, it's interesting, to the extent that I've had any success getting this through to younger people today, you can get it through sometimes by image. And that is, they'll say, well, no, we grew up different than you did, and sex doesn't have to be linked to marriage, and we can be living together before, and so on. But you know where they still understand it? They still understand it with the white wedding dress, the symbols around marriage. See, they still want the symbols. So sometimes what I'll do with young people who are living together before marriage, I'll say this. I'll say, look, now you're living together and so on. So to make your marriage special, would you agree the last week before you get married to live apart? So yeah, we get. What about 2 weeks? And I just bargained as far back as I can get it. And I said, and it'll just make it a whole lot more special. And they get it. I said to them, when you come to the church and she's there, you don't see the bride before the wedding, all these beautiful little rituals we have, it's just going to mean a whole lot more than if you got out of bed together that morning, you know. And they get it. They get it. See, what chastity does, it actually puts very high canopy symbols, and it makes sexuality and relationship much more special. That's what Alan Bloom meant when he says our eros goes lame, because there's no high symbol around it. I know this is being taped, I should probably watch my language, but I want to give you an example here from his book. Bloom says, you know, he said, even our language, because of lack of chastity, is coming down. And so he said, I'm a Neoplatonist. He said, I love Plato. And he said, I read Plato, and Plato says, during their breaks, my students sit around and tell wonderful stories about the meaning of their immortal longing. Bloom said, during their breaks, my students sit around and talk about being horny. Such is the difference. I'm sorry about the terminology, but you get it. See, like, our language is coming down. See, chastity protects language. It protects it. It makes it special. It produces the white wedding dress. It produces the rituals, and it actually makes sex and relationships more exciting. Purity and sexuality and passion always have to go together. If you have one without the other, it's not going to work, you know. See, in our society understands passion, but they don't understand purity or chastity. The churches understand purity and chastity, and sometimes don't understand passion. But you got to be both passionate sexuality with a powerful chastity. You'll have a beautiful marriage. And you know, a lot of our marriage encounter groups and so on, to their credit, they do thoroughly try to teach that. And so that's just some thoughts about the spirituality of sexuality. Again, to get back, the importance of its goodness, its sacredness, its sacramental power. But because of that, it's got to be wrapped in chastity. It's like electricity. It's this wonderful power to make energy, light, and warmth, but it's got to be handled with insulation.